Now I want to talk a little bit more about the pattern that we get and how we have used X-ray diffraction through crystals and other materials to help the progression of science. So X-ray diffraction is really great, not only for studying X-ray spectra, but also studying the structure of the material that you're sending the X-rays through. So like I said before, if we have a crystal where we know the interplanar spacing D, and we know we can sort of analyze the pattern and the angles at which our maxima occur, we can work out the wavelength of the radiation that is passing through that crystal. Or flipping it the other way, we can work out the interplanar spacing or the unit cell size based upon the pattern that we get from after putting the X-ray radiation through the crystal, and if we use a monochromatic X-ray beam. Now, the pattern that we get though is not very straightforward, like what we would usually get if we passed light through a slit. It makes this really pretty pattern, and it's named the Laue pattern after Max von Laue, who got the Nobel Prize for X-ray diffraction in the early 1900s. So I'm showing you here an example of a Laue pattern. So this was really great for working out and what we call imaging crystals. But there are other applications for this, and something happened that was in the mid 1900s, and this was the somewhat very controversial story of Rosalind Franklin and the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. Now, Rosalind Franklin, she was an English, what we call X-ray crystallographer, which is someone who basically uses X-rays and shines them through crystals. So she was a really talented X-ray crystallographer. And her, along with her PhD student at the time, Raymond Gosling, got the famous photograph or the famous diffraction pattern of X-rays through DNA. And this was called Photo 51. Like I said, the story of Rosalind Franklin and DNA is somewhat controversial. Now, Franklin, she joined King's College in late 1950, and she was told by the lab director at the time that she would be working independently. Her colleague at King's College was Maurice Wilkins, and he was under the impression that Franklin would be working with him. So right from the get-go, there was a little bit of tension between the two. So before Franklin even got to King's College, there was some slight tension between them, but when she arrived there was even more. They had remarkably different personalities. Wilkins was much more shy and softly spoken, whereas Franklin, she was much more outspoken, and she was much more what could be considered brash in her approach with people. So not many people worked well with Franklin. Additionally, Raymond Gosling, who I mentioned at the beginning, who got this famous Photo 51 with Franklin, he was actually originally working under Maurice Wilkins at the time. Now, he eventually transferred his PhD supervision to Franklin, and Wilkins was never told about this. So that caused even more tension between the two. Now, Wilkins, he was friends with Jim Watson and Francis Crick, who were both working on DNA as well, but they were working on it at Cambridge University. So therefore, the two groups, the one at King's College and the one at Cambridge University, they were in competition to try and image and work out what DNA was. Franklin was a really well respected and really experienced and excellent X-ray crystallographer. She ordered in very specialized equipment, modified it herself, and took amazing photographs of DNA. And she presented her work, her data and her photographs at a small seminar at King's College in 1951, and James Watson from Cambridge actually attended the seminar at the time. Now, Even though Watson was in the audience though, he admitted that he didn't actually listen to much of what Franklin was saying. He didn't quite understand what she was presenting. So he knew about he should have known, had he been listening, about what she was doing way back in 1951. It wasn't until January of 1953 that Watson visited King's College, and at that time, when he was visiting, Wilkins, without Franklin knowing, showed Watson this photo 51, the famous photo that Franklin and Gosling had taken of DNA. Now, like I said, Franklin didn't know about this, but Watson was absolutely blown away by this photo. This photo would end up being published by Franklin in her Nature article regarding this, but at the time she didn't know, but Watson was absolutely blown away. Now, he was blown away by the photo, but he realized he needed more. He needed specifically the numbers or the data to support it. Now, he didn't have access to the data at the time, but Franklin was included in writing an informal report about this experiment. And this report, this informal but not confidential report, made its way to the hands of the people at Cambridge University. And this was in early 1953, about February of 1953. Now, the Cambridge pair, Watson and Crick, they now had access to Franklin's data and they knew about her photograph, but they didn't tell the people at King's College what they were doing, and they didn't ask Franklin for her permission to interpret her data. They did it without telling them, and this is where most of the controversy comes in. The two were in competition, and the competition was very fierce. Now, Franklin, she was working alone at the time. Well, she had her PhD student. Now, that PhD student, Ray Gosling, he ended up transferring his candidature, I believe, back to Wilkins eventually, because Franklin ended up leaving King's College in 1953, but I'll talk about that in a second. But she was using a slide rule and a pencil to basically measure the pattern that she got after sending these x-rays through this DNA. Now, she didn't have the expertise in the specific areas that she needed to be able to analyze the data. Not only was it very mathematically detailed and complex, but she didn't have the chemistry background to I guess, analyze and make a rigorous chemical model. Now, Crick and Watson, they basically did their PhDs in this area, in this DNA area, whereas Franklin's main expertise and specialized area was in X-ray crystallography. So she didn't have the chemistry backing to support her drive in this. And it's actually really amazing that she achieved and got as far as she did in working out the model of DNA, even though she didn't have the sort of experience to help her. So there was the race happening between Watson and Crick at Cambridge and Franklin at King's College, and Watson and Crick beat Franklin to it. They had the chemistry experience to basically make a rigorous chemical model for the double helix structure of DNA. In March 1953, and this is about the time that Franklin decided to leave King's College. She didn't like the atmosphere, the working atmosphere at King's College, but around March of 1953, Wilkins and Franklin, they were invited to Cambridge so that Watson and Crick could get Wilkins and Franklin's insight on this model, and they agreed that it must be correct. It was decided at the time that the rigorous chemical model for DNA would be published by Watson and Crick, and the data and the supporting evidence would be published by Wilkins and Franklin, and they would obviously do so separately. Now, it takes many years for these types of discoveries to permeate science and then to make a large impact and to then eventually be recognized for that. So the story goes that Franklin actually remained really good friends with Watson and Crick, so there was no bad blood in between them. Now, unfortunately, Franklin died at the tender age of 37 in 1958. And this is a real shame because it wasn't until 1962 that the Nobel Prize went to Watson, Crick, and Wilkins for their work on the structure of DNA. Unfortunately, also, posthumous Nobel Prizes are not awarded. So the main controversy here is that Franklin was never recognized for her work on the DNA structure. But we're trying to make amends for that now, even though we don't posthumously award Nobel Prizes. It's just a shame that she did die from ovarian cancer and that it was awarded to her colleagues and competitors, I guess, after she died. But she did lots of work. Once she moved away from King's College, she went to Birkbeck College. It was much less well known than King's College, but she ended up doing lots of work on modeling viruses and stuff like that. So she did a lot of great work after she passed. So I hope you enjoyed that brief history interlude of X-ray diffraction, and let's keep moving on.